me find the record button. Okay. Okay.
Hello.
Welcome everybody to our
What's the
to Monroe County Community College's presentation for Constitution Day. Let me see here. Yeah, if for the moment, if you're not speaking, if you can make sure your microphone is muted, that would be great. We are going to have a Q&A towards the end, so don't worry about that. All right, so this week is Constitution Week. Well, we call it Constitution Week. There's also Constitution Day. And it's basically a federal holiday where we celebrate the Constitution, and schools all across the country put on various events and hosts panel discussions and all kinds of things for Constitution Day. So that's what we're doing today at Monroe County Community College. So joining us today is Professor Daniel Wood. He's Professor of Criminal Justice, and Professor Edmund LaClair, Professor of History. So, okay. So what I'll do is I'm just going to give a quick little intro into our topic today. And then we're going to go back and forth with some questions with our two panel discussants. And then, like I said, we'll save like 10, 15 minutes at the end for open questions. So with that, we'll just dive into it. Oh, and I also want to point out we are recording this, and it will show up on the Monroe County Community College webpage. So you'll be able to view it there later, or if somebody wanted to see it and they weren't able to see it, you can tell them about it. I can also send the video as a link to you if you want that. So there's that option too. So, and if you should have my email from the email I sent out to everybody, but if not, you can reach me at msnyder@monroeccc.edu. Okay. All right. So the U.S. Constitution, right? This is our founding document of our political society, right? It's the cornerstone of our entire legal system. Yeah. So it's a pretty important document. But even more than those two things, it's also the primary document that confers political legitimacy to our nation. Okay. Long gone are the days of conferring political legitimacy by way of divine right or hereditary bloodlines, or by, owning property, right? Those days are gone. Instead, today we have what we call social contract theory, which is this idea that the population sort of implicitly agrees to give up certain liberties and rights to the government in exchange for certain services and protections. So we'll get into that today in more detail. But the idea is the relationship between government and the people that are governed is it's a contract, and both have obligations to adhere to that contract. And the US Constitution is essentially the manifest form of America's social contract. It stipulates our basic structure of government, the powers of the constituent parts of our government, and the limits to those powers. And it also outlines a number of liberties and rights that the government is not allowed to infringe upon. Okay. So as long as the government holds true to this Constitution, then it'll more or less retain its political legitimacy in the eyes of the American public. Okay. But when the Constitution is violated, there's a sense that the contract has been broken and legitimacy begins to wane. This is why one of the most serious criticisms against the proposed law that you can say is, well, that's unconstitutional, meaning you're breaking the social contract between government and the governed. But this leads us with the question of what counts as unconstitutional. who determines what is constitutional, and how did the decisions about constitutionality of different laws affect the legitimacy or perceived legitimacy of the US government. And then of course, there's the question of, well, why is legitimacy important, or how important is it? So these are the questions we have that we're going to explore today. So I think what we'll do is I'll just open it up with this question for Professor LaClair and ask if you wouldn't mind elaborating a bit on the notion of political legitimacy and social contract theory and connections with the US Constitution.
I have to hit the right button to unmute myself, apparently. So that was not the softball question I was hoping for from you, Michael. It's a little more complicated than something you can do super quickly. But we start with the idea of social contract theory, because this was deeply in the mind of people like James Madison when they're writing the Constitution, particularly since they were sort of quasi-legally replacing the previous Constitution of the United States of America, the Articles of Confederation, with this new Constitution. They really had to confront the idea of political legitimacy, because what they were doing was only going to be legal if they had the support of over half the American population. So the idea of political legitimacy is the more support we have for what we're doing, the more likely people are going to go along with it. And they very narrowly approved of the Constitution, about 55% of the population, over 45%. But because there had been a vote, it had more legitimacy even with the people who had voted against it, who agreed we will go along with the majority, which gets into the idea of social contract theory, because when the European nations are thinking about the idea of why do we form government and how can you have a government if the king isn't divinely appointed, they hit upon this idea of social contract, right? Let's imagine we have no government, we're all free agents with complete autonomy to do whatever we want. Such a state of nature, said Thomas Hobbes in the book The Leviathan, would be short, nasty, and brutish. This is probably one of the most famous quotes in political theory, other than Jean-Jacques Rousseau's "If the people refuse to be free, we shall make them be free," which maybe we'll get to later. But the idea here was we agreed, as you said, to give up some of our freedoms in return for securing the others. And the United States of America is a country that is born from the illegitimacy of the British Parliament in the eyes of the American citizens. It's not that the taxes in the American Revolutionary War were all that high. The tea tax actually made tea cheaper in the colonies than before they had the tea tax. But it was a tax that had been decided without the consent of those who were governed. And I think this is important with political legitimacy, because I think everyone can agree political legitimacy is depressing in the eyes of a lot of Americans today. We see it going down. We talk about the Constitution as a contract between us and our government, and we're already losing some of the idea of the social contract. Our Constitution is a contract between us as citizens that then forms a government of us, again, our citizens. So if there's distrust between us and our government, we've stopped seeing our government as truly representative of our citizens, and we're beginning to see it representative now of almost some sort of alien power, lacking legitimacy. And of course, therefore, anything it does would be a violation of our social contract, that we agreed we would pay taxes and give up some of our property for security. And we'll argue our government is no longer doing those things because our government has now become the government and it's against the people. I hope that gets to your question a little bit. I don't want to belabor too much here, but it is a big topic.
No, yeah, that's perfect, especially that idea that we were breaking away from first the British system, and then there was the Article of Confederations, which fell flat on its face. And so,
in part because we tried to give too much power to the people and not enough to the people we put in government, and so it didn't work.
Right. That seemed to have a crisis of legitimacy, right? Because after the removal of, sort of, I guess, kicking out the British, quote unquote, and then forming the Articles of Confederation. Well, the Articles of Confederation, the new state governments under the Articles of Confederation turned around and just started taxing to pay for the previous war effort. So it was almost a repeat of the grievances against.
Oh, taxes were higher.
Yeah, taxes went up.
Taxes were higher after the revolution.
You have Shays' Rebellion and a whole
Mhm.
second almost revolutionary war. So the struggle of establishing that legitimacy wasn't really done overnight. It was a process. And even though the Constitution was narrowly passed, it seems that it's grown in the minds of the American people as a kind of sacred document that just should not be violated, right? And of course, as we're going to see in a minute, that gets tricky because laws are actually quite complicated, and you can't really just take a sort of literal interpretation of the Constitution. Most of the government was left unwritten, right, for Congress to fill in later in order to get the
the reality, the Constitution is not a contract. Even we frequently refer to it as a contract, and it's really just a constituting document. That, hence the name. It creates the apparatus of government. It gives us a few guidelines and rules, but most of it had to be made up by the first Congress and Congresses since.
That's right. So that I think is a good segue into the next question I had for Professor Wood, which focuses on the question of constitutional issues and the nature of how the Supreme Court rules on these issues, and sort of what's been happening recently with the Supreme Court. And maybe you can give us some case examples if you want about this, and especially about the key question of incorporation.
Yeah, the power of the Supreme Court is historically, and I think Dr. LaClair gives us a little better perspective on that, but it's the basis. It was almost by default, I think, almost taken as opposed to given, the Supreme Court's power in Marbury versus Madison a long time ago. And we have expounded upon that, but it has fluctuated over time because it's based on the whim is probably not the best way of putting it, but the flavor or the perspective of the court at the time. There are some courts that actually look at it and say we should have a complete incorporation, because keep in mind, what we're incorporating is our Bill of Rights. So there's just a small portion of the Constitution that are designed to be the citizens' end of that contract. The government grants us, in theory, grants us those rights, and that's what we have. And so the question becomes, who are we granting the rights to? And it ends up boiling down to a legality issue, because citizens cannot be unconstitutional. Their behavior can violate a law, and then we look at that law to see if it matches the Constitution. And we know that the US Constitution applies to government action, but the US Constitution has been sporadically applied over the centuries based on what we want it to apply to. We know that it always applies to federal government action, direct federal government action. In other words, things like the Federal Bureau of Investigation must Mirandize somebody. But if a state decides that they want to change and put a law into place that changes that, then the question of constitutionality becomes more focused. It becomes more of an issue, because now you've created a law that may or may not supersede, and the Supreme Court or in the Court of Appeals, depending on the level, will then have to address that and determine if that is violating the Constitution. And even to that extent, we have whether we're going to do a complete application where all of the Bill of Rights applies to the states, or are we going to selectively apply it? And we even have a case-by-case basis application, which is pretty much what I would consider our current status. Is the Supreme Court looks at each case and applies it to those facts. And that's how come we're getting some of these unique decisions recently, because they don't want to set precedents, or they're doing their best not to set precedents. And there's even some judges and judicial panels that say that we have a complete incorporation plus certain entities, certain rights are inalienable that aren't even in the Constitution, like rights to food, water, shelter, and healthcare. Those are things that the Supreme Court may in the future apply, but there are some justices that have that mentality, because it is the human factor of the people that we place onto the court. And that's how, we have to challenge the law. A person is not constitutional, it's a law. So a behavior has to violate a law, and then the law has to be evaluated. And that's, sometimes we hear that quite often where, well, that seems unconstitutional. Is it against the law? Is it a law that's constitutional? And then it has to progress. And then we get into the question of, do you violate, somebody has to violate it? Somebody has to do something against that law to get standing. And then you have to go into the court and progress through the court system. The example that I use quite frequently is we have a 1800 law in Michigan. We had one that was swearing in front of women and children. And because it was a $50 fine, most people didn't even care if they violated it in the first place. So they didn't want to take the effort. It became such an imbalance because the $50 fine was easier to do than go through the entire court system and take it all the way up to the state Supreme Court to say, gosh darn it, that is a violation of your First Amendment rights. They just let it go until it was 1997. I think that case was decided. And they finally said, oh, wait, that is a violation. And the only reason it got there is the kid that got charged with it, his dad was a lawyer and did it for free. So he was able to take it through at a much cheaper route. And the burden was a little less than it would be on the average person. So, there are unconstitutional laws. It's just the question of how do they get there, and how do you reverse them, and what does the Supreme Court say? I think that addresses your question, doesn't it, sir?
Yeah, that's pretty interesting, because basically it sounds like what you're telling us is that even if we come across a law that strikes us as unconstitutional, it's not really unconstitutional in an effective kind of sense until the Supreme Court rules on it as such. Until that point, it's there and it's on the books until somebody challenges it.
Correct. And you've got to actually go through the state, because the U.S. Supreme Court will not rule on anything that isn't, if they believe it is state only. That's how a lot of the racist laws in the past have stayed there, because the Supreme Court has said that is a state issue. And then the Supreme Court finally took those on, because the Supreme Court has a lot of relief valves in a sense, to give them an out if they don't want to save face, or if they want to avoid a topic. They have ways of avoiding it. They could simply say it's a state matter, or there's various other things. They can just not take the case at all. They just simply not decide on it.
That's right. The Supreme Court does not have to rule on any case it doesn't want to. It basically decides what it hears and doesn't hear. And just a point of clarification, the Bill of Rights originally only applied as restrictions against the federal government, not state government. So when we talk about incorporation, we're talking about taking one of those Bill of Rights, maybe freedom of religion, freedom of speech, something like that, and incorporating it so that it applies to all state level governments as well. And that's just been a long ongoing process ever since at least the 14th Amendment. So in terms of thinking about political legitimacy, it's not always easy to sort of right constitutional wrongs and pursue a grievance, is what it sounds like, right?
That's
Certainly,
correct. Go ahead.
I point out often, I think this is worth keeping in mind, how incredibly vague the Constitution of the United States of America is. And maybe we can pick on one that's a controversial issue today, such as the right to bear arms in the Second Amendment, which again is not something that's granted to government by the people. It's something that the people said, we have this, we just need the Constitution to acknowledge we've always had the right to bear arms. And the way it's written, it simply says, the well-ordered militia being necessary to the security of a state, the people's rights to bear arms shall not be infringed. And we don't know what that actually means exactly. Does that mean we have to be in a militia to own arms? Does this mean that an individual state, until we started to incorporate the Second Amendment under the 14th Amendment just recently, states could perhaps deny someone the right to bear arms? Does this mean that everyone gets to have any kind of arms? What is an arm exactly? Is it an AR-15, or is it a Sherman tank? Is it a nuclear weapon or a hand grenade or a sword? I mean, I think it's funny. There's some states where I could not walk down the street with a broadsword attached to my back, but I could walk down the street with a Glock in my holster. So we forget sometimes that the Constitution was written in a rush during a summer that was very hot by a bunch of men who were very far from home and very uncomfortable. And they wanted to get something done that they could agree with and leave vague enough that we could figure it out later. And the success of this has been, we can always change what we thought it meant later. If we decide, hey, that doesn't mean what we thought it meant, and the Supreme Court goes, hey, what was once constitutional isn't now, things have changed.
Most of the examples, if you look at what we think is commonplace now, are actually judge-made law. You look at Miranda. People look at Miranda and think, well, that was a gimme, that was normal. That's actually 3 different cases that make up the Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law, and you have the right to an attorney. There's 3 different cases, including Gideon versus Wainwright, that come into play that state that the judge said, well, you have the Fifth Amendment right, but then you also have due process. Well, what is due process? And we've been defining due process for the last 100 years, because really we haven't had a true due process until the 20th century. There wasn't a lot of due process prior to the 20th century. In the 20th century, we started saying that, because up to that point, criminals really didn't have rights. Once you were accused of having there is no place in the Constitution that states that you are innocent until proven guilty. However, judges, and we just implied that, and this is where we bring everything else in. So we bring in Miranda to help with make sure that you get a due process. It was all implied from that due process because the vagueness of the Constitution itself and the Bill of Rights allows for us to do that. But what's to say in the future, maybe that's not going to be the case. I hope not. But with the ability to change, it's there. It wasn't, like I said, it wasn't until the 20th century that we really had many applications of due process at all.
Yeah, and what you bring up about judge-made law raises a very tricky contradiction, because the reality is judges are, they're supposed to be impartial arbiters of the law as written, whether it's statutes, constitutional law, or previous cases decided in previous courts. They're not supposed to legislate from the bench, as the saying goes, and yet they do, right? You can't really deny that happens. And a lot of the better expansions of protections of civil liberties and civil rights, especially for minorities, could argue happen under this context where a judge pushes it a little bit further, and in terms of how they interpret the Constitution to expand rights.
But Dr. LaClair, wouldn't you say that is a possibility, that it was also hindered for the same reason and the same
Absolutely.
method?
The Tawney decision in Dred Scott is a great example of a hold society back from a change that, well, clearly a majority of the society was probably not ready for, but was from the vantage point of justice and correctness, the arc of justice was bending towards truth. And Robert Taney's like, no, not at all. We'll stop that. And that, of course, inspires Abraham Lincoln, angers him so much he gets to political.
Separate
Yeah.
but equal.
Because in the Taney case, part of that was somewhat of an overturning of congressional law to try to regulate which states would be added as slave states and which states would be added as free states, and it semi overturns that law. And the judge is basically saying what the Congress did doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah, in the dicta of that case, Roger Taney actually said the entire Northwest Ordinance was unconstitutional, and that any law Congress had made respecting African Americans as citizens in any sense was wrong because they could never be. And that was clearly an attempt by him, not just to try to pretend he was writing law, but he was telling judges that's how you should treat this, even though the law does not say that, and the Constitution does not support that. It was a really horrible legal decision coming from a pretty otherwise brilliant legal mind.
And that's an unfortunate side effect, because you get bad facts equal bad law. And now you set that precedent that somebody can hang their hat on later. And it takes twice as much to reverse that issue later on. I mean, look how long it took for Brown v. Board and those types of cases to actually get their say and get corrected.
Yeah, it took 56 years to correct Plessy.
Correct.
And that's a really long time, particularly since we fought a civil war to correct Dred Scott.
Yeah, and the Supreme Court overturning itself is something that it doesn't like to do very often.
No.
But this raises again this a kind of contradiction or a problem here, because judges are doing these kinds of things, but in a certain sense, it's always viewed as illegitimate, right? Because they're not supposed to be legislating from the bench. They're supposed to be interpreting the Constitution, but it's not really possible to do a literal interpretation of the Constitution. And
Originalists try to claim they can, but you're right.
They claim they can, but I mean, the fact of the matter is they're at times making it up as they go along because it's all they can do.
Mm-hmm.
But this becomes a problem because anybody who's an opponent of a judge's ruling from a political, not legal, but political perspective, can levy the charge that the judge is acting in an inappropriate way and a politically illegitimate way by stepping outside their bounds. And this is a big problem that the Supreme Court seems to be facing lately, is decreasing confidence in it that it can actually act as a neutral arbiter of law. And this is why political parties now almost take it for granted that a political strategy is to get your candidate into the office of the presidency and then try to put on judges that are politically in your favor. It's almost taken for granted now, and a kind of a strong sense of irony. Supreme Court Justice Amy Colbert just said in an interview a few days ago that she's worried about the perception of the court as being political rather than a neutral arbiter, and she tried to highlight the importance of all the deliberation that all the justices are going through when they make their decisions. But nonetheless, we had that very controversial 5-4 split over an injunction against the Texas abortion law that just came out. And then, of course, Amy Colbert herself was appointed to the Supreme Court like very last minute at the end of the Trump presidency. And her nomination was approved by the same what was it, Mitch McConnell, who a few years ago during the last 8 months of Obama's presidency said it would not be right to approve a Supreme Court nomination so close to an election. But then he does it just a matter of weeks before the end of Trump's election. So that's why I say it's a bit irony that she's there worried about the perception of the Supreme Court as being a fair arbiter.
Well, and it should be a worry because the Supreme Court has historically had a majority of approval, 60, 70, 80% of Americans up until the 1980s. It started to shift when the Republicans attempted to appoint a Richard Nixon loyalist to the Supreme Court named Robert Bork. And he got verb, which becomes out of his name, to be borked when you get kicked off the court because of politics, not because of your ability. And it's been decreasing rapidly since, and now the Supreme Court's approval rating is just slightly higher than the Congress's.
But you will also notice at that same time is when they changed their incorporation perspective and they weren't taking a stand. At that point, you're seeing less and less of a stand and more of a, well, how they deter what they say it is we're taking these on a case-by-case basis, as opposed to the sweeping changes that you saw in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that we're going to apply this with that broad stroke and apply it to as many cases. In some cases, even retroactively, they were allowing cases to apply retroactively. And then when you got into the 80s and 90s, it was much more of a case-by-case basis application. And they're saying, I'm only applying this to the facts in front of me. Please don't use this for anything other than the exact facts in front of us. And that selectiveness, if you can't use it, if you don't have the ability to use it in the future in the broad strokes, what good is it? So as a citizen and as even a legal scholar, how do you use that? What are you supposed to do with that? I think that is the part of the reasoning for that decrease in confidence, because we just don't know where we stand.
Well, and we have to be honest here, just to speak from the other side of the bench, so to speak, is that the Warren Court did quite a bit to incorporate legal protections, particularly for criminals and minorities. And this often created a sense of people in the 1960s and 70s leading into Ronald Reagan's election. The government had become more concerned with taking care of minorities rather than taking care of the majority of law-abiding Americans. And then, of course, what happens, we get originalists appointed to the Supreme Court, and originalists are people who say the best way to interpret law is to not interpret law at all, but to simply read what exactly is the text of the document and move forward with this. Rehnquist was a wonderful originalist, although he runs into the problem of his interpretation is still an interpretation of what's written. It's not what is legally specifically here. And this is all combined to undermine the legitimacy of the court from two different directions, with what we would call liberals today saying the court has given up on these big sweeping protections, these big sweeping ideas, and then conservatives saying, well, the court's still too focused on protecting people who perhaps don't deserve the protection as much as my group does.
Yeah, and people want answers on a lot of these constitutional issues, right? And we're not getting it because the courts are splitting technical hairs to avoid addressing the actual constitutional question. And that's appears to be a very deliberate tactic by them to sort of, I don't know, to just avoid the question and not have to decide it. So all of this is then translating into an undermining of the legitimacy of our political system. So what's at stake, Professor LaClair, with the undermining of political legitimacy?
Historians do not like to answer questions about what happens next, but last time political legitimacy was this low was the 1960s. And before that, it was the 1930s, and before that, the 1860s, before that, the 1800s, when the Vice President of the United States of America was arrested by the President of the United States of America, and the Supreme Court had to try to intervene in there, the Aaron Burr case, which is near and dear to my heart. But we notice every 3 generations, so every 60 years, there's a deep questioning in the United States of America. And I think then it comes to the case of, will we get the kind of political leadership that has always been able to course correct, the Abraham Lincolns, the federal, the FDRs, the George Washingtons, or are we going to get people who are bombastic partisans or people who don't have the support of the majority of Americans because they can't connect across the aisle, in which case I think this is going to get worse and worse. We've already gone since what, Bill Clinton, without half the country agreeing that the president was a legitimate president. He needed to be impeached. George Bush was a war criminal. They said he needed to be impeached. He cheated in 2000. He cheated in 2004. Obama was secretly born in Kenya. Donald Trump was a secret Soviet spy. You know, this is building up to help break down our belief that our Constitution is forming a government of us. So I guess I'm saying I expect there will be more social unrest, much more social unrest as this continues.
So you think more by social unrest, maybe more January 6th type incidences?
We're going to see both January 6th type instances. We are going to see more protests such as Black Lives Matters. And I don't think these are equivalent. Black Lives Matters protests did not attempt to overthrow the government in the United States of America. People at the January 6th insurrection were attempting, maybe not everyone there. Some people were legitimately protesting and exercising their rights. We don't want to confuse that. But the reality is there has always been a small minority in the United States of America that would like to use acts of violence to replace the due process, the Constitution we have, with something that is different. And these individuals in the 20th century have tended to be right-wing extremists, such as the Ku Klux Klan, the Black Legion, the John Birch Society, and today, you know, the Michigan Militia, the Three Percenters, the Proud Boys. I think these groups are going to get more dangerous because when people feel the government's not working for them and is not of the people and for the people, it's very easy to recruit people. And if you're able to recruit these people and get this sense of your own power, that's one step closer to using that power violently.
Yeah, and of course we have the whole context of the pandemic to just add further fuel to the problem. Any thoughts about that, Professor Wood? About political legitimacy? Maybe thoughts on how maybe it could be restored, or whatever your thoughts are.
It's restoring confidence in the government and the government entities and the parts of the government, because we have a separation of powers within the government that we're supposed to have. And when you see those separations eroding, people then lose faith in the documents that establish that. And then in turn, they lose faith in the government itself. If they don't have to follow it, why should I? So I think the first step is assuring that there's the separation of powers, so that if we're going back to that document that established our government, and that's what that document says, then if we can fix that, at least that component will prove to the people that we're following the document that we're supposed to be establishing the power with. And then we can build up from there with the courts, because the courts are supposed to be the arbiters, and right now they're not even taking action. I mean, you've seen several cases of that within the last 2 years, that the courts aren't taking action, and then you have the branch of government that is supposed to be making the laws sitting on their hands, and we're looking at it from a political perspective, because you're creating political wrangling at that point. You see, just using Michigan as an example, you have a governor who decides that there's something wrong that needs to be fixed. Okay, she uses her legitimate power under the law to make a correction. Now, what that's supposed to do is say, look, I found something. We have 28 days to fix it. It says right in the law, 28 days. Well, now the branch of the government that's supposed to fix it didn't do anything, because they didn't favor her, not necessarily the act. They didn't favor her or how she was approaching it. So they just let it go.
Well, and they took it to the courts and tried to get the power and the law changed rather than write a law to fix the problem that led to the action. This was an abrogation by our political leadership in Michigan, and it's a reason we have reduced political efficacy here.
And exactly, you see things like that. And I believe that's what's generating the negative feelings toward the government, because they see that. So until we can get that back on track, I don't think you'll see anyone, any large groups feeling any confidence in the government. And then you're going to see, just like Dr. LaClair said, there's going to be uprising because they feel that their way is better. And pick an organization, their way is better, and they're going to fix it. And hopefully we can fix it before they try to fix it, because I don't know what the outcome is going to be.
So the problem is we have a lot of people in America, on both sides of the political spectrum who feel ignored and out of power. And I think one thing that might help fix this to an extent is we need to focus more on a civics education. We no longer require the kind of civics education it used to be. Even here at Monroe County Community College, we don't require anyone to take a political theory course, a government course, a criminal justice course, a history course. You can graduate college now and have a degree and have never read a section of the Constitution. You might never even know how your government works. And of course, if you don't know how your government works, and what you see on CNN is 30 seconds of Team Blue yelling at Team Red because Team Red did something that created a problem, but Team Blue doesn't have a solution. They just want to yell at Team Red or Blue or vice versa. I think a lot of folks are going to go, well, the hell with all of this. And this guy on the corner here with the silver shirt says, the way we fix the government is we take it back. And so let's take it back. And that's where the danger lies. Democracy only lasts as long as the people want democracy, which is why Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, they come to power through legal means, democratic means, and then they're able to look at the people and go, well, this wasn't working for you, was it? I'll get rid of it for you and I'll fix all the problems.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, because for a lot of people who had the sentiment that this last presidential election was stolen, a lot of that sentiment comes from simply not understanding the electoral process and election demographics. Because in my class, I described what was likely going to happen that evening when they were going to, when the votes were going to start being counted. I said, here's what's going to happen. Trump's going to start out strong. But then they're not going to be able to finish the votes tonight because they're going to have a backlog of mail-in ballots. It's going to take several days. And as those votes get counted, he's going to drop. And based on polling, he's probably going to lose. And it wasn't a mystery on election day that it played out that way to political scientists. It was like, we knew this was going to happen. You can find several articles of people saying that's what was likely to happen. And that's how it played out. But if you don't know any of that and you're just watching, it can be very mysterious and disturbing to see all of a sudden the election stops mid-flow. And then, a week later, they declare the other person the winner. But if you don't really understand voter demographics and how the Electoral College works, which is a pretty complicated, convoluted system, it's an interesting system. But it can lead to confusion. So I think you're right. As good civics education can help ward off a lot of this, not just in this context, but so many contexts.
It's surprising the number of students that come to my courses in criminal justice, which is the foundation of the law. That's where we're at. And they have never seen the issues in the Constitution. They don't know what the Bill of Rights is. So that is something that we really need to push even prior to this. And I think that would help tremendously.
All right, so there you go, Kojo. We need to make political science a mandatory class for everybody again.
Fortunately, Kojo is not a dictator.
That's true. He's the president, but presidents don't have power to do everything. They just get blamed for everything, just like I just did.
Yeah. So I know we reached out to you, Professor Snyder, Kaji and I, about Kaji. Are you on? civics, there's some civics organization that helps with training of students. Yeah, Kaji. And everything doesn't have to happen in the classroom. There's a lot that we can do beyond the classroom. So I don't know, Kaji, if you recall what it is that we reached out for.
No, I need to go back and search. I saw them once on TV where I think this is a Seattle-based organization that tries to educate the citizenship about democracy. I have to go back and search that website. It's pretty interesting because they conduct online courses for the public to educate them into simple basics of democracy. I'll have to go back and search. I did bring it up once or twice and then let it drop. But I will forward it to you all.
So I would love to follow up on that with the three of you, please. Let's see what we can do for our students beyond changing the curriculum.
Yeah, I remember that email. It kind of dropped off my radar as classes got going.
Yeah. And COVID, we were in the, I mean, we're still in the midst of COVID, but
yeah, I'll go back and revisit it as well. It sounded interesting.
Yeah.
So, well, with that, why don't we, in the last 12 minutes, open it up, and if anybody has any questions, if you know how to do the raise your hand feature, I think, or maybe it's easiest just to jump in and raise the question you have or comment, and then we can let Professor Wood, Professor LaClair answer. And I might jump in too with my big mouth. So, and any questions?
Now, going back to the curriculum, Professor LaClair, so at one point in time, political science was a requirement, was it not?
It used to be a requirement, and it ran into a problem of, it's one extra class that students have to take and take. And it was very prescriptive in that it was only political science that we said taught you about citizenship and civics. And I think that does as a broader topic. And there are lots of ideas we could come up with. One thing I'd love to see happen is that we create a scholarship fund or a prize fund or something for students who have completed a certain number of courses that would touch on the civics and give an incentive to learn about this material. But we live in a country today where you can become elected president and know nothing about how our constitutional system of government works. Oh, and we had a question: what makes the U.S. Constitution unique or exceptional in the world? Nothing.
There's a few things.
Maybe our presidential system rather than a parliamentary system.
Well,
what's in our Constitution has been copied from someone else or has been copied by someone else at this point.
Its elements have definitely, you can trace them back to like founding colonial charters, and the language stretches way back, some of it even back to the Magna Carta. But there's two kind of unique things about it. One, it's an extremely short constitution compared to other countries' constitutions. It's very brief. If you pull up Canada's constitution, I don't know, it's like what, 100 pages long or something. Ours is like 30, less than 30, I think. I mean, it's in the back of every American government textbook, and it doesn't take long to read. So it's very short and brief. It's also pretty old. They say some people claim it's the oldest living constitution today, but that actually depends on how you count constitutions. There's a couple other countries that are older than us, depending on how you want to classify things, but it's pretty old. Something that isn't totally unique to it, but a lot of constitutions don't have, is the ability to change it, right? To amend it. A lot of other countries, you just have to start over with a new constitution. That's why Italy goes through a bunch of different constitutions, because they usually don't have a process for changing it. So if they want to update, they just write a new one. And then maybe, I don't know, do you think it would be fair to say that one of the unique things about it? No, I guess that wouldn't count. So yeah, that's all I got.
I'd still say it's not a lot.
No, it's
To write a constitution, you want it to work, you have to have certain elements. And I think that's sort of universally recognized at this point. Many nations have either copied French constitutions and documents, the American Constitution and documents, or the old Prussian Constitution. And that's sort of been the model for almost everyone since.
Yeah, well, it's also worth pointing out that a lot of the newer countries that really emerged in the aftermath of decolonization in the 50s and 60s that were now writing new constitutions are actually much more progressive than the US Constitution. They put in explicit protections for women and for women rights and minority rights. They're very explicit about that.
South Africa's constitution is amazing for what they put into it.
Yeah, so they've, you can say, oh, that's neat, we're the oldest, but part of what goes along with that is that it's the least progressive, it's the most underdeveloped in that sense. So, yeah, I guess that's about it. I think the US Constitution also, when you read it, is a little bit, to me, it comes off a little bit more poetic than more modern day constitutions, which are very dry documents that are really spelling out in much greater detail how the country works. Again, ours is very vague, I think, compared to most other constitutions.
For the Constitution Day meeting.
Oh, he is, okay.
Yeah, he should be done, Damaris, in about 5 minutes.
Okay.
I guess it's official, it came from Penny,
That's right.
guys.
Yeah, Penny, you need to, yeah, okay, now she's silenced.
He's good.
Do you have any follow-up comments about that, Professor Wood? No?
No, I think that
Okay.
you see that the fact that it is vague and we've had a stable government for that duration is probably why it lasted that long, because anytime a government changes, they're going to rewrite their constitution. And I think that's part of the reason why ours is the oldest. It's vague, and then it's able to withstand everything throughout. And then since we've had a stable government, we haven't had to change. The countries that have lost their government or had to change their government also had to change their constitutions.
Yeah, and I guess one final thing maybe is the point, just how bizarre the American government is compared to other democracies. Our democracy is a very bizarre system. Gosh, I mean, where to start? I mean, the electoral college is very different. We also have a lot more elections than most other democracies. When you include not only the presidential election and the federal House and Senate elections, but you also have your governor, your mayor, your state representatives, county board members, education board members, judges, sheriffs. We have a real abundance of a number of elections in our country.
I think that's what makes our government very unique in the fact that we have more of a trickle down effect. I mean, you have governing and the legal power all the way down to the municipal level. It's very hard for, I've introduced this to friends from other countries, and the issue, they cannot understand that there's a minimum of 51 different laws in the state of Michigan, versions of the law, jurisdictions, because you have the federal and then 50 different states, and then each state sets a constitution. So there's 51 different constitutions, and then each state's constitution establishes the government inside that state and how that's going to be dictated. And then down to the very municipality, the little township board. That's a controversy going on right now in north of here in Oakland County, because the local township wants more power, and the state has already said, this is what we're going to do. And who's right?
The
we've got
state's always right.
well, and that's kind of how we've already allowed it for so long. The acquiescence is there that all but you can do everything but what we tell you not to do, in the sense of the state saying, and I think their controversy is something about traffic and sound barriers and things like that, along with the state having a statute that says you must put cell towers in a certain area. And the township says, well, I don't want to do that. And the state says tough. And so now, well, what happened to our ability to govern at our level? And see, that's what makes our government probably, I don't know, somebody may be able to go further on that, but makes our government the most complicated government in the world, simply because of that trickle down effect.
Yeah, that's the federalist nature of the United States. But again, with our vague constitution, it's not clear where the powers lie, and it's always changing, right? You can look at history and see how power waxes and wanes between state, federal, and local entities. And yeah, that's another thing that's like, in certain cases, we don't know who has the authority, right? And that's a case where maybe the Supreme Court could come in and rule, but as we said earlier, they've been, I don't want to say they haven't been doing a good job that bluntly.
They don't want to overstep their
right
in government.
They're very cautious. That's
Yes,
what
the Roberts Court has been extremely cautious.
that's a good way to put it. So yeah, federalism is a whole other area we could dive into for another hour or so, but we are pretty much out of time here. We've got 2 minutes left. If there's any other last minute questions from anybody.
Just a comment. I want to thank you three gentlemen for an excellent discussion. Very enlightening. And I will attempt to learn more about the Constitution.
I have copies if you want one, sir.
Yeah.
Rachel has a bunch of them in the humanities office.
All right, excellent.
So the website that I put up there, Citizen University, check out there, some awesome programs for the community. Have a look at it, and maybe we can discuss and see how we can expand this to educate people, even if you don't have programs within the college itself.
I actually finished their application. I think we need letters of recommendation out from the college, and I could put the application probably tomorrow.
Oh,
Assuming it hasn't changed in the last 6 months.
all right, very good. So we'll follow up.
Okay.
Thank you. Great job.
Thank you.
Great job, gentlemen.
Nice job. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Wood and Professor LaClair. As always, your knowledge and insight is penetrating and enlightening. And yeah, so again, this was recorded. This will be up on the college website probably sometime next week, but you can reach out to me or Dan or Edmund or anyone for a link to get quicker access to it if you need to get it quicker for your classes. So all right, well, thank you everyone, and everybody have a good and safe semester.
As
Thank
always,
you, Michael, Dan, always a pleasure.
All right, goodbye everybody.